The morning mist hung heavy over the Virginia countryside on June 1, 1864, as Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant rode toward what would become his most haunting battlefield. The thunder of distant artillery echoed across the rolling hills near Cold Harbor, a sleepy crossroads community that would soon be baptized in blood and etched forever into the annals of American military history. Grant's weathered face betrayed none of the uncertainty gnawing at his mind as he surveyed the Confederate earthworks stretching like serpentine scars across the landscape. For weeks, his Army of the Potomac had been locked in a deadly dance with General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, each commander probing for weakness, each battle leaving thousands of young men buried in unmarked graves. The Overland Campaign had already claimed staggering casualties at the Wilderness and Spotsylvania courthouse, yet Grant pressed forward with grim determination, earning him the bitter nickname the Butcher among his own troops. The strategic importance of Cold Harbor was undeniable. This humble crossroads controlled vital supply lines leading to Richmond, the Confederate capital that had remained tantalizingly out of reach for 3 long years of war. Lee, the master tactician, had recognized this truth and positioned his battle-hardened veterans behind hastily constructed but formidable defensive positions. The Confederate general's gray eyes held the wisdom of countless campaigns as he watched Union forces massing in the distance. Knowing that another terrible confrontation was inevitable, Major General Winfield Scott Hancock's 2nd Corps had arrived during the night, their blue uniforms barely visible in the pre-dawn darkness as they took their positions along the Union line. These were veteran soldiers, men who had survived Gettysburg and Antietam, yet many carried in their pockets hastily scrawled letters to loved ones. Sensing that tomorrow might bring their final battle, the air crackled with tension as officers moved among their men, checking weapons and offering quiet words of encouragement. According to detailed accounts preserved in the National Archives and referenced in multiple Civil War Historical Society's publications, the positioning of forces at Cold Harbor represented one of the war's most complex tactical situations. Confederate Brigadier General Evander McIver Law's Alabama Brigade had spent the previous day strengthening their earthworks using bayonets, tin cups, and bare hands to dig deeper into the red Virginia clay. These seasoned fighters understood the deadly mathematics of defensive warfare. Every foot of depth could mean the difference between life and death when the Union assault came. Behind log and earth parapets, sharpshooters checked their rifles and counted ammunition, while artillery crews positioned their guns to create interlocking fields of fire. As dawn broke over the Virginia countryside, both armies could sense the approaching storm. Staff officers galloped between headquarters tents, carrying final orders and desperate pleas for reinforcement. The fate of the Union war effort might well be decided in the coming hours. At this obscure crossroads, where 2 of America's greatest military minds would pit their strategies against each other, in a battle that would leave scars on the national consciousness for generations to come. The 2nd of June brought an eerie quiet to the Cold Harbor battlefield, as if nature itself held its breath before the coming tempest. Union soldiers used these precious hours to write final letters home, their pencil stubs worn to nubs as they struggled to find words that might comfort wives and mothers they might never see again. Confederate pickets, positioned in advanced rifle pits, watched the massive blue formations with growing unease, counting regiments and estimating the overwhelming numbers arrayed against their thin gray line. General Grant established his headquarters in a simple farmhouse where he pored over reconnaissance reports and telegrams from Washington. President Abraham Lincoln's administration was growing increasingly impatient with the staggering casualty lists from the Overland Campaign, and Grant felt the weight of political pressure mounting with each passing day. His staff officers noticed the commanding general's increased cigar consumption, a telltale sign of his mounting stress as he contemplated the assault that military logic seemed to demand. The Confederate High Command was equally busy preparing for what they knew would be Grant's inevitable attack. General Lee conferred with his corps' commanders, Lieutenant General Richard Stoddert Ewell and Lieutenant General Ambrose Powell Hill, discussing the placement of reserves and the coordination of artillery support. Lee's reputation as a defensive Genius had been forged in battles like Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, where Confederate forces had inflicted devastating casualties on attacking Union armies. Yet the gray-bearded commander understood that his army's resources were finite, while Grant seemed blessed with an inexhaustible supply of fresh recruits from the North. Colonel Emory Upton, a brilliant young Union officer who had pioneered new assault tactics at Spotsylvania, worked feverishly to organize his men for the coming attack. His innovative approach involved concentrated formations moving rapidly across open ground, designed to overwhelm Confederate defenses before enemy artillery could inflict maximum damage. Upton's soldiers trusted their young colonel implicitly, having witnessed his tactical brilliance in previous engagements. Yet even these veterans felt their stomachs tighten as they studied the formidable Confederate positions ahead. The afternoon brought a series of preliminary skirmishes as both sides tested enemy resolve and gathered intelligence about defensive positions. Union sharpshooters, armed with the latest rifle technology, engaged in deadly duels with Confederate marksmen concealed behind earthworks. The crack of single shots echoed across the battlefield, each report representing another young life snuffed out in this bloody war between brothers. Behind Confederate lines, medical personnel prepared for the worst, establishing field hospitals in churches and farmhouses throughout the area. Surgeons sharpened their bone saws and organized their limited supplies of morphine and chloroform, knowing that tomorrow would bring more wounded men than their facilities could possibly accommodate. The smell of carbolic acid mixed with the sweet scent of Virginia honeysuckle, creating an incongruous blend that would forever remind survivors of this terrible place. As evening approached, chaplains from both armies moved among their men, offering prayers and final absolution to soldiers who might not live to see another sunset. The sound of hymns drifted across the contested ground, Confederate voices singing Amazing Grace, while Union soldiers responded with Battle Hymn of the Republic. These competing melodies seemed to summarize the tragic division that had torn the nation apart, brother against brother in a conflict that had already consumed hundreds of thousands of lives. Grant sat alone in his tent as midnight approached, wrestling with the decision that would define his military legacy. The assault at Cold Harbor represented his best chance to break Lee's army and end the war quickly. Yet every instinct told him that tomorrow would bring unprecedented carnage. To the quiet Virginia crossroads, June 3, 1864. Dawn clear and humid, the kind of Virginia summer morning that promised sweltering heat by midday. At 4:30 in the morning, Union soldiers began their final preparations for what many sensed would be their last earthly duty. The metallic click of rifle bolts echoed along the blue lines as 48,000 men checked their weapons one final time, their hands trembling not from fear alone but from the anticipation that builds before any great and terrible endeavor. General Grant had made his decision during the sleepless night, authorizing a massive frontal assault against Lee's entrenched positions. The plan called for simultaneous attacks by three corps: Hancock's 2nd, Wright's 6th, and Smith's 18th, designed to overwhelm Confederate defenses through sheer weight of numbers. Yet even as Grant issued his final orders, doubt gnawed at his mind like a persistent wound, whispering that this assault might prove to be his gravest mistake. Confederate defenders had used the night hours wisely, improving their earthworks and creating additional obstacles for the approaching Union forces. Sharpened stakes called chevaux de frise jutted from the ground like deadly teeth, while carefully concealed artillery pieces were positioned to create devastating crossfires. Across the open ground, General Lee moved among his men in the pre-dawn darkness, his calm presence reassuring veterans who had followed him through countless battles. Across Virginia's blood-soaked soil, the signal for attack came at precisely 4:30 as Union artillery opened with a thunderous barrage designed to soften Confederate resistance. For 30 minutes, shells screamed overhead and exploded among the earthworks, sending geysers of dirt and smoke skyward. Yet Lee's men had dug deep, and most remained safely below ground level, waiting for the inevitable infantry assault that would follow the bombardment. When the artillery finally ceased, an unnatural quiet settled over the battlefield for several heartbeats. Then came the most terrifying sound in Civil War combat, the rebel yell. That banshee wail that had frozen Union blood on countless battlefields. But this time, it was different. This time, the Confederates were waiting behind prepared positions, their rifles loaded and their artillery crews standing ready at their guns. Historical accounts from the Library of Congress and various regimental histories confirm that what happened next at Cold Harbor would be remembered as one of the war's most devastating tactical disasters. At 5 o'clock sharp, 3 blue waves rose from their positions and began advancing across the open ground toward Confederate lines. The sight was both magnificent and terrible. Thousands of men in perfect formation, their bayonets glinting in the morning sun, flags snapping in the breeze as they stepped off toward destiny. Officers on horseback rode alongside their men, sabers drawn, voices hoarse from shouting encouragement over the growing din of battle. The first Confederate volley struck the advancing Union lines like a massive hammer blow. Entire ranks disappeared in clouds of smoke and spray of blood, as many balls found their marks with deadly precision. Men who had been laughing and joking moments before now lay crumpled on the Virginia earth, their blue uniforms rapidly turning crimson. Yet still the survivors pressed forward, stepping over the bodies of their fallen comrades, driven by duty and the desperate hope that momentum might carry them to the Confederate earthworks. Artillery joined the deadly chorus, Confederate guns firing canister shot that turned advancing soldiers into bloody fragments. The carefully planned assault formations dissolved into chaos as men sought whatever cover they could find in the open ground, many digging shallow scrapes with their bare hands while bullets whined overhead like angry hornets seeking human targets. Within minutes of the initial assault, the carefully orchestrated Union advance had dissolved into bloody chaos. Across the Cold Harbor battlefield, the 3 attacking corps, which had begun their advance in perfect parade ground formation, now found themselves trapped in a killing field that defied every principle of military science. Confederate defenders, protected by their earthworks and commanded by officers who understood the deadly mathematics of defensive warfare, poured devastating fire into the stalled Union ranks. Major General Francis Channing Barlow's division of Hancock's 2nd Corps had pushed closest to the Confederate lines, their Irish and German immigrants fighting with the desperate courage of men who had everything to prove to their adopted country. Yet even these battle-hardened veterans found themselves pinned down in the open ground, unable to advance and unwilling to retreat, caught between duty and the instinct for survival. Barlow himself, wounded multiple times in previous battles, rode among his men despite the withering fire, his voice hoarse from shouting orders that could barely be heard over the continuous roar of musketry. The 6th Corps under Major General Horatio Gouverneur Wright fared no better, their assault grinding to a halt within 200 yards of the Confederate positions. These soldiers, many of whom had served since the war's beginning, had never encountered such concentrated defensive fire. The elaborate system of trenches, traverses, and artillery positions that Lee's army had constructed turned every approach into a death trap, channeling attacking forces into predetermined killing zones, where Confederate marksmen could hardly miss their targets. Confederate Brigadier General John Brown Gordon's Georgia Brigade held a crucial section of the defensive line, their position anchored by artillery pieces that commanded the approaches with deadly precision. Gordon, a former coal miner turned general, understood his men's capabilities and limitations, carefully rationing their ammunition while ensuring maximum effect from every shot. His soldiers, many shoeless and wearing patched uniforms, fought with the fierce determination of men, defending their homeland against what they perceived as foreign invaders. The carnage reached its peak around 6 o'clock in the morning, when Confederate artillery crews began firing double charges of canister shot into the packed Union formations. These improvised anti-personnel rounds turned cannon into giant shotguns, each discharge creating expanding cones of death that swept away entire companies in seconds. The screams of wounded men mixed with the rebel yell and the continuous crash of musketry, creating a hellish symphony that would haunt survivors for the remainder of their lives. Military historians and accounts preserved in regimental histories consistently describe the next phase of the battle as unprecedented in its concentrated violence and tactical futility. Colonel Emory Upton's innovative assault tactics, which had shown such promise at Spotsylvania, proved utterly inadequate against Lee's sophisticated defensive system. Upton's concentrated formations, designed to punch through enemy lines quickly, instead presented concentrated targets for Confederate gunners. The young colonel watched in horror as his carefully trained men were cut down like wheat before a scythe, their bodies piling up in grotesque windrows across the Virginia countryside. Some Union regiments lost more than half their strength within the first 10 minutes of combat, their survivors seeking whatever cover they could find in the churned earth. And among the bodies of their comrades, officers attempted to rally their men for renewed assaults, but the devastating fire made any movement virtually suicidal. Gradually, the attacks ground to a halt, as surviving soldiers dug shallow rifle pits with bayonets and bare hands, trying to create some protection from the continuous storm of bullets behind Confederate lines. Lee watched the slaughter with mixed emotions. While pleased with his army's tactical success, the gray-haired general took no joy in the carnage unfolding before his positions. These were fellow Americans dying in the Virginia dust, many of them barely old enough to shave, cut down in the flower of their youth by a war that had already consumed far too many lives. Yet duty demanded that he hold his positions and inflict maximum casualties on Grant's forces, hoping to break Northern will to continue this bloody conflict. As the morning wore on, it became clear that Grant's assault had failed catastrophically. Yet the killing continued as isolated pockets of Union soldiers remained trapped in the deadly ground between the armies. By 8 o'clock in the morning, the tactical situation at Cold Harbor had crystallized into a nightmare of unprecedented proportions. The Union assault, which Grant had envisioned as a war-ending breakthrough, had instead created the largest single-day casualty list of his military career. Across the battlefield, thousands of blue-clad soldiers lay scattered like broken dolls, their blood seeping into the red Virginia clay, while Confederate defenders maintained their deadly vigil behind earthworks that had proven impregnable. The surviving Union forces found themselves in an impossible position, pinned down in open ground with Confederate sharpshooters controlling every approach. Any attempt to retreat brought immediate death, while remaining stationary meant slow strangulation under the relentless fire. Some companies had been reduced to fewer than a dozen men, huddled behind improvised breastworks of dead horses and human bodies, their ammunition running dangerously low while Confederate bullets continued to search for living targets. General Hancock, his face gray with pain from old wounds and fresh anguish, attempted to organize a withdrawal of his decimated Second Corps. The grizzled veteran had commanded men in some of the war's bloodiest battles, yet nothing had prepared him for the systematic destruction he witnessed at Cold Harbor. His staff officers reported casualty figures that seemed impossible. Entire regiments had simply ceased to exist as fighting units, their survivors scattered across the killing ground or lying motionless under the Virginia sun. Confederate commanders, initially elated by their defensive success, gradually began to comprehend the magnitude of the slaughter they had inflicted. General Lee, observing the battlefield through field glasses, watched Union stretcher bearers attempting to retrieve wounded comrades under flags of truce, only to be driven back by continued firing from nervous Confederate pickets. The sight of wounded men crawling desperately toward their own lines, leaving bloody trails in the dust, moved even hardened veterans to tears. The heat of the Virginia summer intensified the horror as wounded men cried desperately for water that their comrades could not safely deliver. The sound of their pleas carried across the contested ground, mixing with the groans of dying horses and the occasional crack of a sniper's rifle. Some Union soldiers, driven beyond endurance by thirst and pain, attempted suicidal dashes toward Confederate lines, preferring quick death to slow agony in the merciless sun. Contemporary newspaper accounts, including dispatches filed by correspondents from the New York Herald and other major publications, describe the aftermath of Cold Harbor as resembling a vast charnel house under the Virginia sky. Behind Union lines, field hospitals overflowed with casualties that surgeons could barely process. The primitive medical techniques of the Civil War era meant that most seriously wounded men faced amputation or death. With little middle ground between these grim alternatives, hospital tents became scenes of medieval horror, where screams of surgical patients mixed with the prayers of chaplains and the sobbing of men who knew they would never return home whole. The psychological impact on surviving soldiers proved almost as devastating as the physical casualties. Veteran regiments that had maintained discipline through years of warfare began showing signs of collective breakdown, with increasing numbers of men deserting rather than face another assault. Officers reported widespread alcoholism among their troops, as men sought any escape from the recurring nightmares that plagued their sleep, and the constant fear that tomorrow might bring another Cold Harbor. General Grant, receiving casualty reports in his headquarters tent, experienced what he would later describe as the darkest moment of his military career. The normally unflappable commander sat alone, staring at the lists of dead and wounded that seemed to stretch endlessly across his desk. For the first time since assuming command of all Union forces, Grant questioned whether his aggressive strategy was worth the terrible price being paid by the young men under his command. As afternoon shadows began lengthening across the battlefield, both armies settled into a grim stalemate that would persist for days, with wounded men still dying in the space between the lines, while politicians in Washington and Richmond calculated the political cost of the ongoing carnage. The afternoon of June 3rd brought no relief to the suffering masses. Trapped between the opposing armies at Cold Harbor, Confederate and Union forces maintained their deadly standoff, while hundreds of wounded men lay scattered across the contested ground, their cries for help growing weaker as the merciless Virginia sun beat down upon the killing field. Some soldiers had been lying in their own blood for nearly 12 hours, their uniforms torn by bullets and their bodies slowly surrendering to shock and dehydration. Grant, struggling with the magnitude of his tactical failure, initially refused to request a formal truce for fear it would appear as an admission of defeat. This decision, born of pride and political calculation, condemned hundreds of wounded men to unnecessary suffering and death. Confederate soldiers, positioned safely behind their earthworks, could hear the pleas of dying Union troops, but were forbidden to offer assistance. Without authorization from their commanders, the situation created a moral crisis that transcended military necessity, as basic human compassion warred against the demands of warfare. Among the Confederate defenders, the prolonged agony of their enemies began to weigh heavily on consciences, already burdened by 3 years of bloody conflict. Private soldiers, many of whom were simple farmers and laborers before the war, found it increasingly difficult to maintain their positions. While listening to the desperate cries for water and medical attention, some Confederate pickets began covertly tossing canteens toward Union positions during periods of reduced firing, risking court-martial charges to ease the suffering of fellow human beings. The tactical stalemate also created strategic complications for both commanding generals. Lee, despite his defensive victory, recognized that his army remained trapped in a war of attrition that favored the numerically superior Union forces. Every Confederate casualty at Cold Harbor represented an irreplaceable loss, while Grant could theoretically replace his fallen soldiers with fresh recruits from the North's vast population. The Confederate commander knew that time was not on his side, regardless of his tactical successes. Union Corps commanders began reporting serious morale problems among their surviving troops, with entire regiments refusing orders to prepare for additional assaults. These were not cases of cowardice, but rather rational responses to what soldiers perceived as pointless suicide missions against impregnable Confederate positions. Officers who had maintained discipline through countless battles found themselves unable to motivate men who had witnessed the wholesale slaughter of their comrades. Earlier that morning, military dispatches and personal letters preserved in various Civil War archives reveal that the prolonged suffering at Cold Harbor created lasting psychological trauma among participants from both armies. The medical crisis intensified as the day progressed, with Union surgeons reporting that they lacked sufficient supplies to treat the thousands of casualties streaming into their field hospitals. Many wounded men died not from their injuries, but from lack of proper medical attention, as overwhelmed doctors performed triage that condemned lightly wounded soldiers to death, while attempting to save those with more serious injuries. The primitive, antiseptic practices of the era meant that even minor wounds often resulted in fatal infections. Confederate medical personnel faced similar challenges. Though their casualty numbers were significantly lower, Southern surgeons, working with even more limited supplies than their Union counterparts, performed medical miracles with improvised equipment and medications. However, the psychological impact of witnessing such unprecedented carnage affected medical personnel from both armies, with some doctors and nurses suffering complete emotional breakdowns that left them unable to continue their duties. As evening approached, the battlefield took on an apocalyptic appearance that would be seared into the memories of all participants. Smoke from scattered fires mixed with the dust kicked up by artillery bombardments, creating an otherworldly haze that shrouded the killing ground. The sound of wounded men calling for their mothers carried across the contested space, creating a heartbreaking symphony that embodied the human cost of military ambition and political failure. Grant finally swallowed his pride and requested a temporary ceasefire for the removal of casualties. But bureaucratic delays and communication failures meant that many wounded men would die before relief could reach them, turning Cold Harbor into a symbol of military leadership's failure to value human life above strategic considerations. The formal truce finally came on June 7th, a full 4 days after the disastrous assault. But by then, most of the Union wounded trapped between the lines had died from their injuries, exposure, or dehydration. The delay in requesting medical assistance would haunt Grant for the remainder of his life, representing a moral failure that overshadowed even the tactical disaster of the assault itself. When burial parties finally moved onto the contested ground, they discovered scenes that defied description: hundreds of decomposing bodies scattered across terrain that resembled the surface of an alien planet. More than the pastoral Virginia countryside, the final casualty figures from Cold Harbor staggered both military and civilian observers throughout the divided nation. Union forces had suffered approximately 7,000 casualties in a single morning, while Confederate losses numbered fewer than 1,500 men. The disparity represented one of the most lopsided tactical defeats in American military history, exceeding even the disasters at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville in terms of the ratio between attacking and defending casualties. These numbers would fuel Northern peace movements and Southern hopes for negotiated settlement. Throughout the remainder of 1864, Grant's reputation suffered immeasurably from the Cold Harbor debacle, with Northern newspapers dubbing him the Butcher of the Potomac and demanding his immediate dismissal. Politicians in Washington, already nervous about the upcoming presidential election, began questioning whether the aggressive strategy that had brought success in the Western theater was appropriate for the more sophisticated warfare of Virginia. Lincoln, however, maintained his support for Grant, recognizing that changing commanders again would likely prolong the war indefinitely. The psychological impact on surviving Union soldiers proved even more devastating than the immediate casualties. Entire regiments that had maintained their fighting spirit through years of warfare now showed signs of collective trauma that would later be recognized as shell shock or combat fatigue. Desertion rates skyrocketed in the weeks following Cold Harbor, with many veterans simply walking away from armies that they perceived as being led by incompetent butchers rather than competent generals. For the Confederate Army, Cold Harbor represented both triumph and tragedy. While Lee's tactical genius had once again prevailed against superior numbers, the strategic situation remained unchanged. The Army of Northern Virginia was still trapped in a defensive posture, slowly bleeding to death through attrition, while Grant's seemingly limitless resources allowed him to absorb catastrophic losses and continue fighting. Many Confederate officers recognized that Cold Harbor might represent their final major victory in a war that was gradually turning against them. Post-war memoirs and historical analysis, including Grant's own personal memoirs published in 1885, consistently identify Cold Harbor as the commanding general's greatest regret and most significant tactical failure. In the decades following the war, Cold Harbor became a symbol of military leadership failure and the dangers of frontal assaults against prepared positions. Military academies throughout the world studied the battle as an example of how not to conduct offensive operations, with the tactical lessons learned helping to shape military doctrine well into the 20th century. The battle demonstrated that technological advances in weaponry had made traditional assault tactics obsolete, foreshadowing the static warfare that would characterize World War I. Grant himself never fully recovered from the moral weight of Cold Harbor, writing in his memoirs that he regretted the assault more than any other action of his military career. The commanding general, who had earned fame for his relentless aggression, discovered that some objectives were simply not worth the human cost required to achieve them. His willingness to acknowledge this failure, rather than attempting to justify or minimize it, perhaps represented his greatest moment of moral courage. In a career filled with difficult decisions, the battlefield at Cold Harbor today serves as a silent monument to the young men who died in the red Virginia clay, their sacrifice serving as a permanent reminder that military glory often comes at a price that no victory can justify. The lessons learned from their suffering helped shape a more humane approach to warfare, though the fundamental tension between military necessity and human compassion remains unresolved in conflicts throughout the world.